No? Yes?
What?
You've got the list, yeah?
Yeah, how many times do I got to tell you? Yeah, I have the list, Tom. You did something for me there. Thank you, Tom. Thank you. You did something well. It's always such a pleasure to see you. I never knew of somebody that needed to fish for compliments so much as you. I mean, it's really disgusting.
Thank you for finally at least saying thank you, so I can say no worries.
No, I said thank you, not thank you.
Well, how dare you? Welcome everyone to Nick and Tom's Intercontinental Adventure on the PWTorch Daily Cast. You are joining myself, Tom Colohue, and my colleague Nick Barbati, and today we're not going to mess around, we're going to dive straight into it. Triple H has brought a lot of people back to the WWE. We are going to rate, we are going to rank, and we are going to talk about the intricacies of each return. We're not going to be focusing on debuts from NXT, so there may be a few names that seem like they're missing, but we'll clarify those as they go. Some returns have certainly landed with a bang and made a big impact. Others, unfortunately, not so much. But in Triple H's WWE, a lot of people are coming in with losses. So even if they're not necessarily hitting the ground running in the same way they would under Vince, is it a bad thing? We're going to talk about that as we go. But Nick, first and foremost, with the amount of people who've been brought back, how do you feel the current roster is coping?
Well, the current roster is robust, which, it certainly was not on the last day of Vince McMahon's reign in WWE. We are looking at a very, very different roster, a very different WWE, with both a lot of new energy that's there and new excitement and new ideas, and some old bad tendencies that I think people are finally beginning to see weren't maybe just the Vince McMahon thing. It might have been just the WWE culture thing. So, in general, I would say the roster is full. It's to the point, though, where to me, as I've mentioned many times here, I worry that it is too full. And we're going to be focusing today on returns and, obviously, as you said, Tom, not necessarily the debuts from NXT. But the issue here that I think when we talk about some of these is everyone's hoping, whether it's the wrestlers themselves or the fans of the wrestlers, that in this new era, the folks coming in are going to be brought in at the absolute peak of their existence. And that's impossible to do when we're talking about the sheer volume of people that have now returned or debuted under Triple H's watch. The issue here is not everybody can debut at the top, and not everybody can win. And that can create a very frustrating environment. And it took a few months to reveal itself, but it most certainly has. And that's really where we are today.
Absolutely. The first name on this list is, I think, the most obvious, that has not landed exactly as you might expect. They've not landed particularly on their feet. They've been in a big program. They've been on pay-per-views back to back, but haven't necessarily hit the heights as regards any form of success. We are talking Karrion Kross alongside, of course, Scarlett Bordeaux. Now, Scarlett has primarily been a manager. She can wrestle. She's wrestled in Impact and other promotions as well. But she is entirely being used at this point to sort of protect Karrion Kross, to be not necessarily his backup, but to do the job for him at times. I do have serious questions about this booking. You bring in someone like Karrion Kross, whose character is, well, he was formerly called Killer Kross. His character is an absolute monster, a complete destroyer. And what's actually happened is that he can't win a fight without Scarlett, and even then, he can't quite win the fight. What have you made of Karrion Kross with Scarlett Bordeaux so far?
Well, I don't think he's a killer nor a destroyer. I don't think those are words that anyone would have described it, especially if this is your first or second time seeing Kross, especially when you're taking into consideration his previous Raw experience. I think there was a lot of issues with this. First of all, from the moment that Kross re-debuted with Scarlett, there was a lot in that moment that could have gone really, really right. And it, quite frankly, could have gone and been an entirely new day for him. The problem is the man is still the same. And I don't mean that necessarily as a knock on him personally, but is he main event level quality? No. So when you match that with main event level booking, that lack of connection and synergy of his quality of performance versus the role that he was being brought in to fill, I mean, there was already problems at that jump. There was another issue with it, apart from, the fact that it was always going to reveal himself that he's still Karrion Kross, is they waited too long to get to him to actually be in a match. and actually as a direct threat to Drew McIntyre. He was making appearances, and there was references to him, and we went too far from the initial attack to just video packages, to where in this day and age you are forgotten. If you're not on the screen, if you are not in that ring, you feel like you're a B-time player. And I think so, taking that into consideration, we were already not off to a good part. Tom, you referenced Scarlett and her role with Cross. Here's the thing: she's the best part of that act. And in a bygone era, she would already be separated out from him and put in a main event storyline, or at least upper mid card, or at least being used for WWE promotional purposes. They have not done that. They're not obviously going to split them up. I think that's probably the deal of them coming back in.
Yeah.
But even her entrance, which is the best part of that entire act, has now been co-opted and was used for Sarah Logan last night on SmackDown. So there's challenges here, but I think it's a dead act. I really do. I don't see it coming back in any meaningful way.
I do completely agree there. I do think the issue, as much as anything, is putting someone who clearly isn't main event ready into that main event program, as you've said. If it'd been put against someone other than Drew McIntyre, I think there's opportunity here. If he'd been working with Sheamus, I think he would have stood much more of a chance of getting over there. He could have been working over Butch, working over Ridge Holland, and in many ways the same way that Gunter has been working so far. If it had been put in the role that Braun Strowman has been put in since returning, taking on the Monsters, taking on Omos, and picking up wins, I feel that would also have been a lot more effective. But what's happened is he hasn't wrestled. He barely wrestles, even with Drew McIntyre being involved. He's been a pay-per-view wrestler apart from one match with Madcap Moss, and he struggled to win that as well. Which that for me is a real indication that there are not big things planned for Karrion Kross. Now I get that they're trying to protect a lot of people. They're trying to make sure a lot of different people have opportunities, but he needs to squash some people. At the very least, for me, you fix the booking by having him squash some people, work his way back up towards Drew McIntyre. You're going to have to take your time with this. Similar to how Rusev was when he first came in. But at the moment, I am not excited to see Karrion Kross on my TV screen. I'm not excited to see Scarlett Bordeaux because of what she represents. In addition, I just don't feel they're actually going to crack through and get over with any sort of audience if this is all we get from them.
Yeah, well, Tom, the issue is he was paired with big wrestlers. So when you even say Sheamus, I would call foul on that too. You can't be a killer and you can't be a destroyer against the bigger guys on this roster and have that be established. Maybe down the line, that should be a dream match that is formulated based on how he'd been booked. But here's the other thing. He didn't wrestle with a move set that indicated he was a killer or a destroyer. There was absolutely nothing interesting about his signature moves. And in this day and age, that's what you're looking for when you can clip something, put it on Twitter, when someone really debuts of, oh, you need to see this one. Yeah. There's nothing interesting about anything that was done in the ring. And ultimately, that was always going to reveal itself.
Yeah, the entrance is the most viral part, and that's an issue. It's sort of a Triple H thing. He likes his big entrances, but you've got to be able to deliver in the ring. You've got to get that viral moment. And for me, they're just not there. Next up, returning at SummerSlam as part of Damage Control, we have Dakota Kai. Now, admittedly, we could talk Damage Control wider here, and I think we will. Io Sky was still under contract with NXT, so she was a call-up. Bayley under contract with WWE, returning from injury. Dakota Kai is the only one we're really going to focus on here as a returner because she was released and then came back. So, Dakota Kai, where do we think she lands?
Well, I think Dakota Kai stands as the most important return of everybody under the Triple H watch. How about that one, Tom? And I busted your chops.
A big moment.
I busted your chops when you told me that we needed Dakota Kai to help save the women's division. As you remember, I mocked you openly. I laughed in your face.
You did.
You know what? We did need Dakota Kai. Maybe not as a solo act, but in the presentation in which Damage Control has been brought in. That is, let me put it this way. It's a compliment towards Dakota Kai as well as Io Sky and also Solo Sikoa, okay? In that they are folks that have only been here for a relatively short period of time, but they have already become so interwoven into the fabric of the show that you almost can't remember a time when they weren't there. And that's how well I think they've acclimated to the roster at this point and how important they've become to the overall storytelling. There is no more important act within the women's wrestling right now than Damage Control. They are the nexus of which everything else is revolving, whether you realize it or not. They are holding it together. They're what War Games is going to be all about. And I don't think there's another act under these returns that can truly honestly say that if they weren't there, that the product would be significantly less than. And I think Dakota Kai paired with Io Sky is an act that we can say that about.
I do remember when we first started talking about Triple H taking over and who would he bring back. The first name I mentioned was Dakota Kai, because she is just someone that has sort of the Triple H principles. Everything that he wants, she can do. She can recover from losses very quickly. Under Triple H, everyone takes some big losses. She is unique in the ring, has a great range. She's comfortable on the microphone, but she also has a presence about her. Even if she's just in the background, she has that presence. You've mentioned Solo Sikoa there, another perfect example of this. Someone who, even if he says absolutely nothing, because let's face it, he doesn't, you still feel that presence. I also would say that Rhea Ripley is much improved at the moment with her work of Judgment Day. So there's a little bit more of that similarity. I remember you calling me out for that one quite rightly when she first came up, because when Rhea Ripley first came up to the main roster, she was not the Rhea Ripley that we saw in NXT. It was a huge disappointment for me personally, but now we're getting there. Dakota Kai, as soon as she came back, had that feel that she had in NXT, the heel after a little bit of carnage, the scrappy fighter, sort of a butch element to her. Paired with Damage Control, she's been refined. She's been refined in a much stronger way that makes her much more impactful. She's had a couple now of tag team championship reigns, so she's getting some championships under her belt. She's being featured on both shows. I call this a win for Triple H any day.
Yeah, it's his biggest win in many ways of everybody we're going to talk about today.
Next up, let's talk Hit Row. And by that, we, of course, mean B-Fab, Top Dollar, and Ashanti the Adonis. There is no Swerve Strickland. He is, of course, in AEW and signed there. B-Fab added to the women's division. There's actually quite a strong presence for women in this list. The women's division certainly bolstered. Top Dollar seems like he's been the one treated like the star. He's always getting the hot tags. Ashanti the Adonis, I feel, falls into the background a little bit, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Rick Boogs, when he first came in, while he drew attention in the entrance, he did fall into the background afterwards. We've just mentioned Solo Sikoa falling into the background a little bit, so not necessarily a bad thing. That said, Hit Row have not exactly found success so far in the WWE. They've already been sort of pushed to the background by the arrival of Legado del Fantasma. What do you make of Hit Row so far?
Well, I think that they're middle of the road. I don't think that they're a sheer disaster. And I think there's the possibility down the road to add somebody to their act to ultimately elevate them. I don't see how they get elevated in the current iteration right now. I think you're right. There's a bit of a definition down on them, but maybe that's what they were brought in for. I do think that they served a very important purpose for Triple H, though, in that I think when they re-debuted, it was a sign that Triple H saw something different in people than Vince did. So that was an important message to get out there. And I also felt like it was younger. It felt more relevant to the overall audience, the demographics, added diversity to the show. I think all those things were really good. But I also think a more important lesson was made when they had them go out there and perform. And I think that was indulgent. It was, too far of a reach for the entertainment purpose. And I think one thing that we've seen since that is them be that approach to them be reined in. And sometimes you need to have a lesson of failure, which I think that segment ultimately was, to have, an overall benefit moving forward. I think that is there. I still think BFAB is a star. I think she gives off incredible amount of star vibes and star quality. I think that's important. And I think for what they serve, which is adding layers and depth to the tag team division, for right now, they are just fine. Could they disappear tomorrow and you wouldn't even notice and it wouldn't make a difference? Absolutely. So that's a problem there. They have not made any kind of indelible mark into the show, onto WWE at all. But I still think the possibilities there. I think it's there more so with them as a heel act, for the record.
I think a lot of this comes down to expectation, and a lot of it is about why they were brought in. I think we can all agree that Hit Row were not brought in to become tag champs and hold on to them for years. That's not the situation that we've got there. They were brought in to bolster the roster. They were brought in to be a capable hand. They can certainly wrestle in an entertaining manner. And as you say, BFAB does have that star power. The fact that we were teased with BFAB versus Zelina Vega but didn't quite get it.
Sure.
The fact that we're being teased with more wrestling from BFAB. She's wrestling at live shows, for example. I think there's potential there. But as much as anything, this feels like an act that will finish its career exactly where it is right now. And that's okay. You do have to have teams like the Usos, like New Day, that are focused almost entirely on the tag divisions. Don't get me wrong, it's nice to see the Kofi Kingston singles run, the Big E singles run, the Jey Uso singles run. But for years, they've been tag team operatives, and that has elevated the tag team division to no end. Having people who are just willing to fight for a particular championship elevates that championship. The Miz for the Intercontinental Championship, for example. You need teams like that. And it fits the agenda, I feel, in the tag team division that Hit Row are sort of SmackDown Street Profits in that they spend a lot of time backstage, they host parties, they host events, they have an element of fun about them that other tag teams don't necessarily have. There's just a bit more life to them. They're not just wrestlers. Because with quite a lot of the teams you see, tag teams like Viking Raiders, like Legado del Fantasma, they come across as just wrestlers. We're just here to wrestle. The fact that you have teams like Hit Row who don't really care when they take a loss, they're just there to have a good time. That makes it feel a lot more realistic to me, at least. Because I don't think there's any workplace that doesn't have people like that in it. Hit Row for me won't be tag team champions anytime soon. But I think if we accept that that was the plan all along, they've actually landed very, very well, been pretty well received. And like you say about a lesson in failure, they've been a very good litmus test for Triple H because they haven't always been fantastically received. And that's allowed Triple H to learn on the job. As much as anything, I don't think he's learned on the job with Karrion Kross of the people that we've already mentioned because he hasn't adapted anything to Karrion Kross. But with Hit Row, I definitely feel Triple H is learning and developing. Next up then, we have our first member of The Way. 3 members of that one to mention, though of course I'm sure we'll touch on Austin Theory at least a little bit later. We had the return of Johnny Gargano, Johnny Wrestling, Mr. Wrestling from NXT, one of the only people in NXT to get a 5-star match. I remember that against Andrade Cien Almas, and it was a hell of a match, I tell you that. But to be fair, Lars Sullivan got a 5-star match in NXT, so it's hard to really work out at times. Johnny Gargano returned with very little fanfare. And in many ways, that's been a big help to him, I feel. Because he just walked down one day, wrestled a couple of good matches, and now he's working with The Miz. In many ways, there's been no mistakes made with Johnny Gargano. They're not pushing him hard. They're not pushing him far. He's come in. He's having great exhibition matches. He's having regular promos, and he's regularly on TV. I think he's been a great addition to the roster. Nick, what do you make of it?
Well, I think he can simultaneously be a great addition to the roster, but still the booking of him is still concerning for the long run. I think there's a problem with him, Tom. He's coming across very unlikable. And I think that annoying element to him, that might just be, I'm familiar with his matches in NXT, as I would always go back and watch the pay-per-view premium live event matches of his, but without knowing truly in depth the character. Here's the thing. I think he's coming across like an annoying little brother. And if that's the intent, I don't see why this isn't the guy that I was sold that when he comes in, he's going to be that underdog who you just root for, that Daniel Bryan character. I don't see that. I see him being annoying. And that storyline that he's in with Miz and Dexter Lumis and the recording and all that kind of stuff. Listen, there does need to be an element of storytelling in wrestling right now. It can't just be wall-to-wall wrestling. Someone like you would not be drawn to that, right? Like self-admittedly.
Yeah.
However, there's a part of it where it feels, and Triple H should be conscious of this, too much of that previous bygone era. Where obviously, not everything that Vince McMahon did was wrong. Nobody thinks that in theory. But it's these little components that feel to Vince McMahon like, or at least the elements that people associate with him that they didn't really care for. And I still think that's where we are. I think at this point, after the Miz storyline, one of the things I would really like to see out of Johnny Gargano is a showcase in-ring feud. And I don't even care, Tom, if it's, the crowd could be dead for the first match of it. But I would like to see him treated as WCW treated the old school cruiserweight matches, which was when they first debuted, people didn't know what they were watching. So they probably didn't react in nearly to the level of enthusiasm and excitement that they came to react as. But once you expose them to that great wrestling, you can't deny great in-ring work. And I think with Johnny Gargano, it's the in-ring work that does the talking. That's that kind of wrestling, that Mr. Wrestling quality about him that makes people want to come back and watch him over and over again. So I think we do need to get to a showcase match, not just a high quality exhibition match, as you were saying, but a real showcase in-ring performance that feels culminating of a feud, but feels more exciting for a new day on, wow, what could he do in there? What he did in there with this guy, maybe it's the Miz. Can you imagine him in the ring with, and then start listing out everybody. And I think ultimately he should be at a stage where he's an underdog contender to take out Roman Reigns. I mean, that's what that character is, right? He's the undersized, great wrestler. And I think that's what I really want to see him more leaned into for.
It's very hard, and I've followed Johnny Gargano quite closely on NXT because of the quality of wrestling, even though I'm not necessarily into that. But it's very hard to nail down exactly who his character is. Now, it's impossible to ignore the Daniel Bryan comparison. The comparison is very strong. Just a great wrestler that you root for because he's a nice guy. Not enough is said about the fact that Daniel Bryan got over as a heel. He got over because he shouted the word no, and so people shouted yes. So many people seem to forget that the yes chant was made to annoy someone. It wasn't made to support anyone. It became to support someone, but it was designed to annoy people. The best talkers always get over because the audience can annoy them back. That for me is like, I remember The Rock trying to stop people from saying his catchphrase, which only made them say it more. Daniel Bryan was such a weird guy. And that really works for the character because he had so much personality. He was this little annoyed troll to so many people. With the beard and with just his expressions, he'd huff up his shoulders, he'd play up to it, and he'd just say no to everything. He became amazing to hate this guy, so much so that there are so many steps that made that face turn work. Firstly, being that annoying. Secondly, the loss to Sheamus in seconds. But also injuries, I feel, really helped Daniel Bryan. The fact that he had to relinquish the World Championship after WrestleMania 30, people really rooted for the guy even more at that point. The fact that the company didn't seem to be taking a chance on him. The fact that Triple H was trying to shut him down, and in many ways Batista's return worked to that element. You don't get another Daniel Bryan without that much steps. Now, particularly on Johnny Gargano, his initial personality for his most popular run for me in NXT, the feud against Ciampa, his entire storyline, his entire character was guy who got turned on by Tommaso Ciampa. That was it. He had no real established personality beyond that, beyond the fact that he was a great wrestler who'd been turned on by Tommaso Ciampa. When he was paired up with The Way, he got there. Then he really got to show who he was. He had the family dynamic, and he was able to show himself as this intentionally weaselly guy who actually does love his family. And it was so strange seeing him try and reconcile the fact that he doesn't want to do anything, but he loves them so much he has to. That was entertaining. And I feel that's why he's working with The Miz, with Dexter Lumis and the like now to try and establish that. But it does need to be established in WWE main roster, because at the moment, he is just great wrestler, and that is it.
Right. But Tom, here's my problem with what you just said. He was able to establish that character on the back of an already established appreciation of him.
Yeah.
Right? If you are looking at him now with this new lens on the main roster, that does not really exist. He's just annoying. And yes, he's having great matches in conjunction with that character being revealed, but it isn't with the established respect that's on his name. Yes, certainly by a good portion of the audience, but not a significant enough for it to be leaned into entirely. I listen, you heard it here from me. Take from it what you want.
I totally agree that he needs one big, like proper feud to get his teeth into. I don't think the Miz is the guy. I do think the Miz helps establish the character and potentially the way. I'd like to see him against a Finn Balor or a Seth Rollins.
That works. Yeah,
Someone
that
who
really
really
works.
works his style particularly well. You know you're going to get a great match, but also you're going to root against the guy who's going up against a Finn Balor or a Seth Rollins right now. That said, Seth Rollins seems to be turning face, so who really knows at this point? And maybe that is a plan, given that Austin Theory is involved. Who can really tell? I think Johnny Gargano's very middle of the road at this point. His wrestling matches have been great. He's in a good storyline. He's not been expected too much of, but we haven't really established who he is, why he's there, or what he's doing. Next up, then, I want to tie into the way that we've established there. There was someone else there in the list, but I'm going to skip slightly ahead. Dexter Lumis, one of the first people to really return. And since returning, I got to say, I'm not a fan. Dexter Lumis, for me in NXT, just didn't really have the personality to make that transfer to the main roster. His entire thing is having a very stoic face. And when you have an audience that automatically root for you and have that goodwill in NXT, that works. When you get to the main roster, you need a lot more than that. You need people with you. That's why I think Johnny Gargano is working with him. But essentially, for the past 4 or 5 months, he's been following the Miz around, and I can't say anything else about this guy other than for the past 4 or 5 months, he's been following the Miz around. What have you made of Dexter Lumis?
Well, I think you're not wrong. I think as with many of the people that we're going to be talking about today, the best thing about it was the debut, the return. And I think one thing I really liked about his return in particular was, it was presented in a much more dramatic way. It felt like something had gone rogue, which is always exciting, without completely throwing out the actual narrative of the show that we are watching. I thought, it was interesting, but you always at the same time knew that the act wasn't going to live up to that level of interest. And especially now, as it being so closely tied to The Miz, The Miz serves a unique spot on WWE TV. I think he is reliable. He is entertaining. There's really no denying that. But he also fulfills a certain level of the show that is, somewhere at the mid card, but doesn't feel blatantly mid card. It's like almost like an established act that everyone can appreciate. It's not an insult to be associated with him, but it's also not so great either. You're not going to be the next world champion after having gotten through the Miz. So with that said, with Dexter, I think that there is no storyline that is attached to him as a person or any motivation that is attached to him. I find him too cartoonish by half. I don't like the name, and that seems minor, but there's just some names that you can't get past. There's too closely associated with other things in pop culture. So you have him with the show Dexter, as you had Dolph Ziggler with the Boogie Nights character.
Yeah.
These things matter. And I think ultimately, Tom, everything that you've laid out, there's, again, as I say, if this character were to disappear on TV tomorrow, would it be noticeable? No. And I think that while in many cases that is fine, I do think Triple H, I think he needs to go back and almost, really revisit some of these earlier debuts and returns that he had, because ultimately they made a splash, but did they count? And was he able to rewrite the narrative that would have, in a drastic way, that than what it would have been if someone else, namely Vince McMahon, was in charge? And here's the thing: sometimes it's okay to admit, the debut he was able to give him was great, and people thought it was going to be the start of a new day. But the truth of the matter was that moment right there, that was their great moment, and everything else kind of realigned to where it would have been otherwise. And I think that's what happened with Dexter Lumis.
I do agree there. He hasn't made much of an impact. He hasn't really made a bump in the ratings or anything like that. Working with The Miz is exactly as you say, it's slap bang in the middle. You're not going to fall down the card after working The Miz. You're not going to go up heavily the card with The Miz. It's an establishing point. The Miz has been a kingmaker in the past. Nowadays, he's more of an establishing force. That's been the case for a while. Working with Logan Paul, I feel, was a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
Just trying to basically say to the audience, hey, look at this guy. That's The Miz's job now, to make you look at the other guy. To round out the way, I have to talk about our third return of that particular group, Candice LeRae. And I'm struggling at this point to think of things that Candice has actually done. She debuted. She's been working in and around the team of Damage Control, but we haven't. Sorry, pardon me. We haven't seen her regularly. She's not been on every week, and she was briefly teased as a part of the Damage Control and the Bianca's team for War Games. Still very much could be, but Candice LeRae seems very in and out. She seems very low down the card because she's not really noticeable as being there at this point. As I say, low expectations on this one. She came in as an able hand, clearly. She's not going to be competing at the top level anytime soon, and I don't feel she's going to be pushed particularly hard. But Candice LeRae.
Well, it becomes very clear that there was a thorn in Triple H's craw that he felt that there weren't enough women on the roster. I mean, that's really been made very, very clear by the debuts and the returns that we are been talking about, or that we will not be talking about, that was priority number 1 or 2, maybe, paired along with this reestablishing the importance of championships, was getting the women's division more full. I think Candice LeRae has been the least important of any woman that has come onto the roster within the past 6 months. And I think that in many ways, while that might be okay, there began to have this feel, as we've talked about, Tom, of it just felt like a collection of characters. It felt like a collection of people. And, there are people that are going to serve the role of just filling out the card. And you're right, Candice LeRae still might be in War Games. That's still, I think, a very real possibility. But I think there is just something so uninteresting about her character. We've been given no reason to be interested in her. And I think the problem with that is when you have other people who are at high risk of being seen as uninteresting, like Emma, like Mia Yim, there needs to be the time put into them to give you interest, but you can't have that all happen at once, or at least I don't believe you can. I think that this is a case of there needed to be storyboarding to all of these returns and debuts, and allow each woman a week or two truly to establish their character, truly to establish their signature moves, to establish who they're aligned with and why. What is their motivation? They all don't have to have the same motivation of going for a championship. And I don't think Candice LeRae reads that way. But if that's not her motivation, then what is? These are the things that are missing. So when you talk about Candice LeRae from the way, I don't care if she goes away. How about that one?
I think the group in general, Johnny Gargano, Dexter Lumis, Candice LeRae, even to an extent Austin Theory, we haven't really established their motivations, any of them. Austin Theory went after a secondary championship and lost his briefcase on Raw this week.
I don't go there yet.
Well, I'm just confused. The way in general, like I mentioned about Hit Row, they aren't necessarily motivated by the same things, and that's okay, that's good. But I'm not sure what any member of the Way are currently motivated by. And that makes it very difficult to root for them, especially if they're given prominence. Like, if you're working with The Miz, you've got prominence at the very least. And it's just not really landing for me. Candice LeRae has come in under the radar, at least relatively under the radar, and I don't think she'll change much in her position. I think she'll be part of the Way once they are reformed, but I think that'll be her role, just sort of a background character. That's the most I think we can reasonably expect from her. From that, though, I want to go on to what I would say is probably the biggest success of the returners that have been brought in by Triple H so far, and that's Braun Strowman. Now, Braun Strowman has been protected in many ways. He's been made to look a monster, but he hasn't been up against main eventers so far, and that's been a big help to him. He's not necessarily been taken on jobbers either. Working with Otis, working with Omos has certainly helped to elevate him beyond where he was previously, even when he was working with Brock Lesnar. When he was working with Brock Lesnar, he looked out of his depth in the extreme. Working with Roman Reigns, he looked fantastic. The right opponent can make someone look like $1 million. It really can. And I feel Braun Strowman's been working with the right people. Now, I haven't seen the match of Omos because I don't watch Saudi Arabia pay-per-views. But I do know that he certainly loved it and certainly rubbed a lot of people the wrong way in the locker room by loving it so much and publishing that on Twitter. So Braun Strowman is a difficult person to get behind at times. But I feel this iteration of the character is very easy to get behind. He's not been overpushed. He's been featured regularly. He has been much improved on the microphone, and he hasn't been unstoppable. He's been taking his hits, and I really do think that benefits everyone around him. Jinder Mahal in the World Cup match attacked him from behind, got a few good hits in, whereas previously I feel Braun Strowman would have immediately destroyed him and not sold any of the offense. This is a new Braun Strowman, and I'm very happy to see it. What do you make of Braun so far?
Well, I think he's been protected by everybody but himself. And I think that one of the dangers with Braun Strowman is that ultimately you can put on a performance of who you are for only a finite amount of time before some of the challenges of what people experience with you, if you do not put the work in to change, will reveal themselves again. And I think that that's that issue with the tweet from Saudi Arabia. That was a character defining moment.
Yeah.
It was someone who was not interested in the overall team atmosphere of the locker room. I think it was unacceptable. I think it was uninteresting. I thought it was disloyal. And I thought it was shameful when you're talking about when you're working with people who put their lives in each other's hands to do work. That's what I thought about Braun Strowman. Okay, so we'll go to the more superficial things. Yeah, he's been presented better. He's been, rising to the occasion in a bit of a better way. I agree with you that the act works better now than it would have otherwise. I know a little something about being paired with somebody who's otherwise seen as lesser than. So I'm the Roman to your Braun Strowman, Tom. Like, I get it. Like, I'm there with
Sure
all
you
of
are.
that stuff. It does work. Do I see this not being an issue moving forward? I think he's going to be an issue. I really, truly do. And I think these reports of him being on his best behavior backstage, people are all well and good when they need to smile and nod. Yeah, Get them behind a keyboard feeling a little loosey-goosey. That's when you see the real them. I'm not interested in him. I'm just not. I thought that was not where I wanted to be. So, but again, going back to the more superficial elements of the performance, do I see it as a main event act? Well, I don't think it should be. I think it should fulfill that special attraction type layer. I don't think we should have a proper like monsters champion or super heavyweights championship, but that is what he is. He should be the Big John Stud of this roster, and just fulfill that very special whoa type quality when someone walks into the ring. And that's all well and good with me. And I think what they're doing well now is by not having him destroy established acts in such a damaging way, everyone has been just fine, if nothing else, from those segments. I think when his return first came through, there were a lot of groans because it felt like old chestnut with him coming down and destroying these really important tag teams. I'm glad we've kind of avoided that approach since.
Yeah, I do feel once again Triple H has learned as he goes with Braun Strowman. I love the idea of a Monsters division. I don't necessarily want a Monsters championship or anything like that, but the idea of that special attraction, the great Carly element, but who can actually wrestle, for example. The Big Show was always that element, even though he had a lot of back and forth. I can see Braun Strowman dipping into sort of general population when he works against people like Bobby Lashley, Sheamus, Gunter, but other than that, being kept to one side. That approach, however, does not favour someone who appears every single week. So I do feel maybe they could afford to step off the gas with Braun Strowman at least a little bit, give him a couple of weeks away while they work out who his next big opponent is going to be and go for that. Because at the moment, he seems like the obvious choice to win the World Cup and take on Gunter at Survivor Series. I don't think Gunter gets out of that one with the championship, unfortunately. I don't see Braun Strowman losing. That said, it would be a lot of fun for, I think, everyone involved and make a real statement of intent if Gunter did win that contest. So at some point, Braun Strowman's going to have to lose or he's going to be straight to the Intercontinental Championship. One of these two is going to happen over the next few weeks. So it's over the next few weeks, I feel, that we'll really start to work out what Triple H's plans are for Braun Strowman. Because at the moment, it certainly seemed as though he's had some of the most planning behind him. He hasn't just been dropped in and we'll work it out as we go. But at the same time, Braun Strowman is being kept separate for a reason, and we'll find out what that reason is soon. We have another tag team to discuss, and that is the return of the Good Brothers. This is Luke Gallows and Carl Anderson, who return to support AJ Styles in his competition with Judgment Day. I don't think anyone could have returned with less fanfare than the Good Brothers did. There was barely any reaction. And I was at a New Japan show where they competed on both nights in London, a Royal Quest 2, about a month before they returned to the WWE. So it was the beginning of last month, the beginning of October. And that was the only act where no one cared. The entire audience, barely anyone even reacted to them. Everyone else got something. Big cheers, big boos, whatever. Nothing for the Good Brothers. And when I saw them return to Raw, it was a very similar reaction. I don't know if their role is anything other than backing up AJ Styles. I don't see them as competitors. I don't see them as contenders. Maybe they're just here for the payday. If so, good on them, do your thing. I don't really feel they add anything to the roster, and I don't ever feel that they will personally. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel as though we know anything about them. I think that that's been the same sentiment in all of their runs in WWE. I think in particular about Carl Anderson, I know zero. I don't think I've ever seen a great match. I know I have not seen a great match with him. I have never learned anything about him. I don't know why they are back, I guess you could say. Tom, I remember that when they came back, I was like, of all of them, but why? You know, if this is it, I mean, it instantly read of this is a make happy for AJ Styles.
Feels like
This
nepotism.
is, you know, for this his personal benefit that then was going to bleed over into the professional environment. And whether that's true or not, that's the impression that was given off. But it has, in many ways, I guess you could say, given AJ a bit of a personality, which had been missing for a couple of years at this point. I don't say that it's not a breath of fresh air for him. It certainly is not. It's it's fine, all things considered, I guess, to, you know, give him more screen time, have him be able to have a bit more confidence, and now have him in there with the Judgment Day. That's all well and good, but you know, of all the others, you can see kind of the need for why they were brought back, whether it was to fill out a tag team division or, you know, add some depth in certain, you know, spots. This one never made sense to me. It still doesn't make sense to me. I don't think we've seen a real reason. Gosh, I sound like a grump about all these people coming back. And it's not that I'm not willing for them to be there, but I think you're right, Tom. I think the cake is baked that this is the bodyguards of AJ Styles. You know, Gallows through his look, almost like you can create your own story about. Like you can kind of add more depth of character to him than maybe would otherwise be there, just because of his unique, you know, feel and vibe. But Anderson, I mean, he's just like that bland bald guy. I mean, he's the what could be of Giovanni Vinci in Imperium, but at least he's having great matches. And I think you can't say that about the OC. The OC just seems old, right? It doesn't feel like the original club. It feels like the old club. So, sorry.
I do have high hopes that this may see a return of Southpaw Regional Wrestling. I don't know if that's something you ever checked out, but it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun, and I feel that's the biggest benefit we could get. They do just seem to have been brought in to appease AJ as much as anything. There are plenty of other people on the roster, and I feel this is really where it becomes clear that we're getting diminishing returns from these returns now, in that the roster is now getting to a point where it's full enough, but we're still adding more. So we know that the Good Brothers returning is going to take TV time from this tag team. It's going to take TV time from this tag team. We're just not going to see a lot of people with really high potential because of so many people returning who don't necessarily have dedicated futures lined up in the WWE.
Can I ask you a question where you might kill me?
Yeah, always.
I don't know anything. You know, I don't really keep up on the rumor and gossip and all that kind of stuff. But the last time we saw them, when was the last time we saw them really significantly?
It was the Boneyard match.
Yep, that's where I'm going with this. Do you think that this is leading to a one-off special in-person version?
Boneyard match?
Well, with Undertaker at WrestleMania.
Oh, no.
Is that...
No.
Wait, is that a no? It's
No,
not going to happen? Or
no.
I don't want this to happen?
Stop talking.
No, you know exactly what I'm saying.
No.
And you know I'm a little witchy, Tom.
Oh.
That's all I'm saying.
I grew up loving The Undertaker. At WrestleMania 33, I cried because he was wrapping it up And
All
I
right, well,
felt
that
like
was ridiculous.
I
That was
felt like
ridiculous.
the
We were
match.
right.
I was wrong in feeling that the match was intentionally booked in a certain way to make it look like, okay, it's time. This guy can't do it anymore. There was an element of pathos to it, and it just felt like a brilliantly wrapped up story. He fought until he literally could not fight anymore. And then he keeps going. But we've already established that he can't fight anymore, and he definitely couldn't. I loved The Undertaker. That is past tense now. If he comes out of retirement, I am going to be furious.
Okay, well,
As a fan,
ma'am, calm down. It was an
furious.
idea.
Hate it.
But okay, but literally no one else thought about WrestleMania 33 in the way you did. So we're gonna
That
put
is
that in a
true.
box.
That is definitely true.
We're,
I
we're
was
gonna
definitely
put that
wrong.
on the shelf, so you don't get to represent that as a universal opinion. Not that you did, but let's not act like anyone else agrees with that, including the Undertaker.
I was very open about that fact that I was wrong.
No, I know you are. I'm busting your chops. What? Grow up, Tom. This is how friends talk to each other.
You put me in a
But
bad mood now.
but I do think it is possible. I think that you're hearing rumblings of, all of the stars, quote unquote, coming out for the next WrestleMania. And here's the thing, as I've said before, is this a real possibility? Who knows? But things that we acclimated to during the pandemic, during the isolation time period, as being, you almost try to convince yourself, like, oh, this was brilliant. This was almost better than it would have been in front of people. Nobody looks back on things during that time period and maintains that opinion. People are just so happy to be, I think, back to the world that we knew previously, that in many ways, the things that took place, especially in regards to The Undertaker during the pandemic, when you think of the anniversary event at the Survivor Series, when you think of that WrestleMania, the Boneyard match, it feels antiquated, I guess, compared to what we're seeing now. And you wonder, is there a possibility? Here's the other thing. Get the hate mail ready. AJ Styles hasn't been the same AJ Styles in a very long time, since before his Nakamura match at WrestleMania. I don't find him to be the greatest wrestler in the world anymore. I don't find him to be all that interesting, period. I mean, if we're talking about winding things down, I could see that being unfinished business for him.
I do completely disagree as regards AJ Styles not being the same since the Nakamura match. I will say, I don't think he's ever been a big deal on Raw. He never has been. On SmackDown, he's always been treated like a big deal. I don't know why. But as regards after that Nakamura feud, we had the Samoa Joe feud, we had the Daniel Bryan feud, we had the match of Brock Lesnar. We still got great work afterwards, in my opinion, but
I didn't say we didn't. I don't think he was the same.
There is a clear Raw SmackDown divide for me when it comes to AJ Styles. No one else has that. No one else has it. But he's never been treated like any sort of big deal on Raw. Whereas the second he steps foot on SmackDown, he's main event. I don't know why, but it is what it is. I'm going to skip ahead slightly and just sort of skip one return so I can come back to it later. Emma returned last week on SmackDown in a losing effort against Ronda Rousey. The next three names we haven't really had much time to get our teeth stuck into, so we're not going to be really talking too much about them. Emma came in with a loss. Since then, she stepped up to Xia Li. She spoke to Shotzi backstage. It seems like this is going to be a slow burn back towards Rousey and main event, but at the moment, she's been defined clearly down. The reaction to her return wasn't the strongest either. What do we make of Emma returning?
I don't make anything of it.
Is it just a blank neutral for you?
Yeah, I mean, I thought she was fine in the backstage segment with Shotzi. I thought that was, that, by the way, that entire acting, by the way, wasn't bad on any of the people involved. It really wasn't. Namely, Shayna Baszler. I was kind of happy for her that it wasn't like so stiff. And I thought Ronda did great. But I thought Emma, set that tone. So we're now going to a flirt thing with her and Madcap that defines him down from where he would have been a year ago. Maybe a year. He would definitely define down from, I would say, from if Vince was still there. Yeah. But this is a nothing thing. This is a filler. Come on, let's go.
It's okay for it to be okay. She came in, had an okay wrestling match. She's had some okay backstage segments. Okay is absolutely fine. Sure. Next up on the Raw side, we've just talked about the OC. Mia Yim has returned to join the OC against Judgment Day for reasons. Any idea what those reasons might be?
What? Well, I mean, to go up against Rhea Ripley, is that what you're saying? What are you interviewing
I
me for
I
tomorrow? Don't do your
genuinely have.
Barbara Walters routine.
I'm genuinely hoping for advice here because I have no idea why she would side with the OC.
Well, I thought it was very telling that when she first revealed the hood and people saw the blue, they thought it was Sasha Banks. And then when they realized, oh wait, that's not her. That's literally not her body, and then no one cared. I thought the fact that they missed her initially attacking Ripley wasn't great. We just saw her writhing on the ground, like I'm doing like Gollum style. And then even though she's tougher than everything else every other time, but apparently she couldn't absorb that hit. That was a problem. The shots with the kendo stick is fine. It just feels like a stale act. And Medium, I've never seen it. I've never seen it work, which doesn't mean it can't work. But there's no great act that I know exists there. It might. I haven't seen it, so hopefully this is the platform to begin that. But am I excited? No, but it's certainly a better entry point from her than she would have otherwise. I would say that.
I agree with you there. It's at least a high profile position to be in, but in many ways, I agree that I've never seen a match or a storyline that convinces me to back Mia Yim. At least not yet. If they can book something that tells me who she is in a way that I find relatable, I'll care a lot more. But at the moment, I don't know anything about her, despite watching some of her matches in NXT. Her wrestling matches for me are solid. They're okay. I'm waiting to see something that tells me why I should care.
Well, I think why you should care should maybe be unseen on screen. I think sometimes you bring people back to establish relationships by people that you want in the long range
Yeah.
that this person is connected to. How about that?
Yeah. Sarah Logan returned on last night's SmackDown, helping out the Viking Raiders to beat up B-Fab and Zelina Vega. Sarah Logan has been teased over the past few weeks in vignettes. Essentially, she's tied directly to the Viking Raiders and just seems like a mouthpiece for them. What do we make of this one?
I think it was fabulous. I loved the makeup. I loved the Scarlet Bordeaux entrance. I thought everything. This was the Sarah Logan that is at her peak, at her maximum possible presentation. I don't think I could have ever seen that potential in Logan prior, and I think everything about that worked. I don't know that that makeup looked very very elaborate. So you wonder if that's going to be something that's going to be recreated week in week out. And I bring that up because it might seem like a minor point, but it's really not. That redefined her look in a big way because she has kind of a softer face. And I mean that in a nice way. I'm not talking literally about her cheeks or I'm just saying she's got like a kind look to her. And if you're this killer, this vicious person, that gets, kind of lost if you look like you're someone you would want to sit and have a panini with. So I would say that this makeuping, the costuming was awesome. I like her with the Viking Raiders. I think this one was a hit. But again, the debuts and returns are great. It's the follow-up. And as we've talked about throughout this show, if you were to stop us at any point after every one of their debuts, that was great, that was good, and then life happens. So we'll see. But I think the Viking Raiders, they're better than the rest. I mean, they're bigger than the rest. They're better than the rest. They're newer than the rest. They're more vicious than the best. So, and I say that because I think that they could be challengers to that tag team championship in ways that Hit Row and Legado, not so much. So I think that these are more important.
I agree with you there. Sarah Logan's definitely elevated from where she was just by this association. She certainly was treated like a much bigger deal in ring. It looks like we're about to get, a 9-man tag? Well, 9-person, I should say, because of the possibility of Hit Row, including B-Fab, Legado, not including Santos Escobar, so Zelina's involved, and Viking Raiders, including Sarah Logan, in tag team match just around the ring. That would be very entertaining, I feel, and it would be a very good combination of different characters. Viking Raiders, I think, would work very well with Top Dollar, whereas Legado worked very well with Ashanti, for example. That said, the Viking Raiders are the only tag team right now, outside of maybe the Street Profits, that feel like they might actually be a threat to the Usos. So if they need to be a new and vicious version of the new and vicious version that we already saw of the Viking Raiders, so be it. They've been here a while. It's about time they got a shot for me, personally. Sarah Logan's fortunes are tied directly to them. And I've saved this one for last. We spoke about it last week. I actually am a bit more positive this week than I was last week because of the inclusion of LA Knight. Bray Wyatt returned at Extreme Rules. He has spent his time since, either out front or backstage, talking about himself and his impending character. This week is the first time he actually interacted with anyone, going after LA Knight. And it looks like LA Knight will be looking for some form of revenge. So who knows how it's going to go, but I'm at least a lot more interested than I was last week with Bray Wyatt, because the pace of this storytelling, it's not for me. It's taking far too long for me personally. I just want a bit more than a breadcrumb. To feel that there's a bit more planning than, okay, you're going to get this tiny bit and Bray's going to talk for 10 minutes about nothing. It's starting to feel like Triple H circa 2001, where anything he said would immediately be forgotten because none of it meant anything. I know that Bray Wyatt is weaving so many different things in with this, and that in 2 or 3 years we'll look back at one of these promos and say, oh, he meant this. Oh, he meant this. But right now that means nothing to me. Right now it means nothing. I know I'm being short-termist. I know I'm being impatient, but this is Bray Wyatt. Every single promo, he feels like less of a big deal than he did coming out of Extreme Rules for me personally. Nick, what do you reckon?
Well, I think being outperformed by Max Dupree isn't so great.
Are you leaving it at that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, how much more is there to talk about, Tom? We've done this, I feel like at every episode for years. I feel like we've done it for every birthday, bar mitzvah, Christmas. I mean, how many times do you have to have this conversation?
Yeah.
It is, you just lied. You lied right there. You know better than to know that not everything is going to count in the long term, right? They're going to try to pretend that things counted the next time he re-debuts, or the next time some new characters, and he's going to go back in the archives and try to research. He probably will, and say, oh, I said this on this one day, so let me bring that in, as if it was all interconnected. It is not. This is not this is not a great act. It's dominating, right? It's dominating time. It's dominating interest. The production of it is very, very interesting. And I think one thing that is different about Bray Wyatt from someone like Karrion Kross is there's a charisma within him that exists that is not present in lesser people, right? So he is. I don't mean to just demolish Wyndham Rotunda as a person. That's not the case. But I still think we don't know how this exists in this world. And again, if we're looking at the Game of Thrones type reference and we're viewing him as like the Night King of the White Walkers, does the Night King interacting, so freely with LA Knight? I don't know. That doesn't. Something in there doesn't resonate with me. I still think I have concerns. I don't see how this translates to an in-ring match. I think that I think there's a lot of magic that exists there, but nothing that ultimately really interests me. Can't say it does.
No, I agree with you there. And I do think the Game of Thrones reference is on point for this one. The Night King and the amount of time the Night King spent separate from everything, building up and building up and building up. I could see that working with a Roman Reigns, for example.
Sure, absolutely.
I could absolutely see that working. I could see it working if you go with a Game of Thrones direct reference. I could see it working with someone new who's being built up as we speak. Someone a bit of an underdog. Again, this is not trying to be a reference to Johnny Gargano, because we've mentioned that word with him, but someone who is developing and coming towards that level. I can see that working. I could see a Kevin Owens, for example, ripping Bray Wyatt's entire character for the entire run of the character name Bray Wyatt apart in one promo. This is a big risk for me. If you give someone like Kevin Owens free reigns in ring with a promo on Bray Wyatt, he will demolish every single aspect of that character. That is the big issue with Bray Wyatt for me. He does not hold up to scrutiny. He's mostly being held together, at least at the moment, by goodwill. LA Knight massively overperformed.
Yeah, I think you're all right. You're right about that. A couple things, Tom. I think, do you remember when The Fiend first debuted? I don't think that anybody, in the shape that he was in and the costuming and everything, if you were to tell us the next iteration of his return, he's going to come back in an express cobalt-colored sweater, that we would have been thinking like, oh, that's where this character ultimately needs to go. And I keep saying this, I'm not a body shamer. I do not care what people look like. How it's just, this isn't a flattering look for him. He can be whatever body he wants and still be awesome. That is not it. But there's just nothing menacing or tough looking about this presentation. He looks very ordinary. And I think that maybe that's what we're going for, right?
Yeah,
Maybe
I
that
think
is
that's
a
the point.
layer to the character, but I don't find it compelling. And that just might be me. Maybe, but maybe there's a time when someone comes back too many times. Maybe there's a time where you get too creative by half. I was actually spending some time thinking about and talking about this with some friends recently. And pardon the reference, I talk about Madonna a lot. I won't want to talk about Madonna. I'm going to talk about Lady Gaga, who I don't really quite enjoy. But I was equating, Lady Gaga came out, and I think she debuted in like 2008, really on a large scale. And I think one of the understood elements about her career trajectory was, her big thing was she was kind of latching her cart onto the wagon of reinvention, which people like Madonna and others, and Bowie and whatnot have, became their signature, right? That was your way of staying relevant, was being able to float and change and alter and keep the people interested in what you were going to do next.
Yeah.
But by the time 2013 came along, she came out with an album called Art Pop, and it was purposefully declaring herself art rather than just a pop star. And it was all about this new character, and people turned off to it. The album sold significantly less, and the song that she put out initially was called Applause, and it was all about being adored and the fame and everything. And the meta elements of it were not it just wasn't of interest to the people who just wanted to just dance. They just wanted to have the person that they initially fell in love with back. And eventually she found her way back through her talent, and kind of her live performance did all the work. So I guess I equate that directly to where we are at with Bray Wyatt. There's a part where things get too meta by half. You think almost like you can see the performer becoming too interested in themselves, and I think that's definitely the case here. And it's ultimately going to be his in-ring work that determines whether this is a success or not. And we've talked about before, the in-ring work, if you're going to ask it to speak for itself, it could scream. It could scream.
Just before we wrap up, there's one more thing I do want to get your opinion on. Triple H has received a lot of criticism for one particular booking choice. Monday Night Raw, we mentioned it earlier. Austin Theory cashing in his Money in the Bank briefcase for the United States Championship and not winning it. It's the first time the briefcase has been used on anything other than a World Championship. Nick, I just wanted to get your opinion on this booking choice. And do you feel Triple H was backed into a corner with Austin Theory's briefcase?
So get the tweets ready. I think I would have made a very similar choice. Now, here's why. First of all, I have always said this. I think we as wrestling fans, I would say, significantly smaller amount of us than there were at the peak of wrestling, but still a significant amount of people, have gotten used to the Money in the Bank thing. I think can I tell you this? Let me go back. This is a little bit of a story. But I remember, was it WrestleMania 32 with Braun, with Rollins, Tom? 31, 32? 31. I remember watching this with my friends and my family, and we're sitting there watching it. And I, of course, know what Money in the Bank is. And I remember all of them, the whole lot of them, going, what was that and what just happened? Because they didn't know what it was. And they felt like they'd been cheated out of 3.5 hours of their lives. That might sound absurd to a dedicated wrestling fan, right? Which is what you assume WrestleMania is for. But I literally remember one of my friends saying, none of this makes sense. And that has hung with me for a very long time. And there were a series of those big pay-per-views where there was like a element that was like reintroduced, and you were like, wait a minute, where did that come from? And so since that time period, I've always kind of soured on Money in the Bank as a gimmick. I think it is limiting. I hate that it has ended reigns, namely of Charlotte Flair, which ultimately damaged that character because they had to do something with the briefcase. And then you had two floating around. It was just too much. I think Triple H, this was probably the last of the big things that he inherited, that he knew he didn't want. and probably didn't want for the right reasons. And I don't think it's because he didn't want Austin Theory. It's you don't want Austin Theory damaged by having him in the ring with Roman Reigns right now. There's no reason for those worlds to collide right now. So you have this briefcase situation, and then what do you do with it? You've already gone most recently with the path of Otis, who had the briefcase and then lost it. Like, there's just really nothing interesting. There was no energy behind this anymore. And it began, the briefcase itself, I felt like, was defining Theory down on its own. I think having shed this briefcase allows him to exist in the world with Bobby Lashley and Seth Rollins in a more confident way, because you don't it's literally not a gimmick that he's carrying around with him. Now he needs to sink or swim based on himself as a wrestler. I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think it's a burial of Austin Theory. I think it's a reset of Austin Theory. At least that's how I look at it. And I think hopefully this creates a dialogue moving forward of what to do with these briefcases and this Money in the Bank thing. I don't find it nearly the impactful gimmick that others do. I much prefer the Royal Rumble. I think it has in many ways watered down the Royal Rumble. But I also think that even you saw this past year, Money in the Bank for years I felt like was a growing show that was becoming one of the top shows. Something happened in the past 2 years where that seems to have faded. You saw that they had to reduce the size of the stadium that they were in for that show. I think people are kind of over this gimmick a bit, and I'm leading that charge. So just my two takes.
I could definitely see the Money in the Bank premium live event going the way of the dinosaurs, and the Money in the Bank actual ladder match being moved to a different show, most likely a WrestleMania, or in fact a SummerSlam, which I feel maybe could benefit from having a gimmick match like that, just to sort of help it over the top. The Royal Rumble has been a little bit damaged by this because there's suddenly a lot of access to championships, like the top championships. But then the top championships have been very, very well developed over the last few years, being held by Roman. They feel separate from the vast majority of the roster. That's a good thing for the championship, so not necessarily a great thing for the rest of the roster. I do feel this was just an effort to get the briefcase off Austin Theory. It was never going to be a successful cash in on Roman Reigns. That simply was not going to happen. And the reset has been needed. But with the amount that Austin Theory has lost recently, it is a clear defining down. I do see it as at least a slight burial at this point, bringing him down. But at the same time, he was the Vince McMahon guy. After what happened with Vince McMahon, how do you actually recover from being the Vince McMahon guy? Very difficult situation. He needed a reset, and I think we finally got that reset here. I'm not sure what the next step is for Austin Theory. I'd personally put him with the Way again, and I'm excited by that concept. I don't know if that's become clear over the course of this podcast, but that's what I personally see happening. For me, it was necessary, and now that it's happened, we can see a new Austin Theory emerging from the ashes.
Yeah, I don't agree with you at all. I don't think that I think this whole burial notion, that's not, listen, I'm not a Triple H guy. I like some of his work as Booker, but that is not his motivation. I also don't think right now in the post Vince McMahon era I think that there's a consciousness to not, quote, bury anybody. I think there's a high consciousness about, tone of locker room and how people are, treated. I do. I think that that's not right. I think this was a clear reset. I've said this before, Tom. You know what I would do with Austin Theory is pair him with MVP, and especially if he's going to be in there with Bobby Lashley. I think that something about that image works for me.
We will wrap it up there. Say thank you very much, everyone, for listening. If you'd like to hear more from us, you can find my work on Twitter at Colohue, that is Colohue, and on YouTube at youtube.com/@TomColohue. What I will say just before we wrap up there, expect me to move a lot of my work off of Twitter and onto YouTube as regards shorts, community, and videos from here on, given the hellscape that Twitter is becoming. Nick, where can people find you?
Well, as you know, Tom, I'm on assignment in Atlantic City, on assignment for someone, not for PWTorch. But I am here performing tonight in Atlantic City at the Ocean Casino. So do I think anybody's coming? No. But you can find me there. And I mean, you have to fill me in on this hellscape that is Twitter. I think it's always been a hellscape. Now the mask just is off. So, at Nicholas Barbati, NICHOLAS BARBATI.